debunk the Trinity in 1 minute?
Well, it's very simple. They believe the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. These are all gods, but they are not the same as each other. So the point here is that if you think about it, they are all dependent on each other.
All dependent.
So if some
Okay.
So first of all, when he says they're three gods, that's wrong. Then when he says they're all different, note now here he's intentionally, I think, or perhaps he's just not intellectually swift enough to realize he's being elliptical. He's not specifying what he means by saying they're not the same. When Christians distinguish between Father, Son, and Spirit, we're not making an ontological distinction between the being and essence of Father, Son, and Spirit. In that respect, they're not distinct. They're not separate. They are identical as to their essence. The distinction pertains to their personhood. So it has to do with relations, personal relations within the Godhead. They're not substantial, essential, or distinctions of nature. The persons of the Trinity are absolutely one. In fact, we're going to get to this in a bit, but I would maintain that Christians have a much stronger view of divine unity than any Muslim has ever had, and certainly stronger than what Ali Dawah advocates as a putative Salafi.
Is he a Salafi?
Well, the Salafis are constantly at each other's throats, not just at the throats of other people. So what you might be seeing and sometimes wondering, is he a Salafi? Is him going after somebody else? Like, what's the guy's name? There's another guy at Speaker's Corner.
Shamsi.
Shamsi, yeah. Shamsi is a diehard Salafi. And Salafis often turn on each other. If you don't, cross exactly every I or dot every I and cross every T exactly the same way they do, then they'll call you on it. But these guys do affirm.
They have this thing. If I may quickly add, Anthony. Ali would consider himself a Salafi. Muhammad Hijab would consider himself a Salafi, but they would not explicitly say, I am a Salafi, or proudly say it, while the others do. And in Ali Dawah's view, so Salafi is somebody who supposedly follows the first generations of Muslims exactly and does not deviate much from their views. And the way they view it, they are Salafis, but other Salafis right now are extreme Salafis who do not follow the first generations, but rather who follow other Salafis and turn them into their greatest leaders. So he accuses, therefore, those other extreme super Salafis as heretical within this whole Salafi movement. And whereas those Salafis accuse these guys of being not real Salafis because they invent other things. So it's all a giant mess, but they all explicitly or implicitly are Salafis.
Yeah, because I was just wondering, because I remember way back in the days in the debate, I pointed out I had assumed Muhammad Hijab was a Salafi just based on the way he acted, and so I mentioned that according to Muslim scholars, Allah has literal body parts, and then he laughed it off later. What scholars are these? But that's like standard Orthodox Salafi doctrine.
But what he's doing is he's again playing on the crowd's ignorance. When they say that Allah, they think that it's somehow an escape clause. When they say Allah has a face, or Allah has hands, Allah has eyes, he has a shin, he has feet, and so forth. Now, note that carefully. I said a shin and feet, because you got to be very strict in your Salafism, right? The Hadith only affirms a shin, not two. You can't infer two shins just because there's 2 feet, right? Just like you can't assume that Allah has a left and a right hand just because he has 2 hands. The Hadith say he has 2 right hands. Well, what they will then say is, yeah, he has these anatomical features, but they're not like ours, and we don't ask how. And then they'll give examples of what they mean by not asking how there can be two things that have hands and feet, but they're not the same. So they'll say, for example, an elephant has feet, but they're not like our feet, right? So Allah has feet, but they're not like our feet. So they're very special feet, right? In the sense that we're concerned with, it doesn't matter what these feet look like, right? Whether they're hideously grotesque, like I don't know, like a rhinoceros or something else. It's the fact that they're ascribing some sort of anatomical features to them. So hijab's just playing on the fact that they do qualify it and say, we don't mean that his feet are just like our feet. We don't mean that his hands are just like our hands. But they're still affirming hands and feet and all of this.
Yeah, they're most definitely affirming that Allah has body parts, and so it would be interesting to see how. Well, it'd be interesting to see what, like, if we applied Ali Dawa's reasoning to his own. I mean, I'm assuming we're planning on going there at some point, but like, is Allah's shin dependent on Allah, right? Like Allah's shin is not the same thing as Allah's face. Allah has a face and Allah has a shin. They're not, a face is not a shin. Those are two different things. So it seems they're distinct from each other, and yet they're both, what is he going to call them? Part of Allah? Are they dependent on Allah? Are you can't say they're independent, because then they'd be separate things. So I don't know. It's just, it seems like it can be difficult to apply concepts to God. But if you're going to apply concepts in the way he's doing it, do so, one, correctly, actually use correct definitions that if you're talking about someone's position, and two, be ready to have them used in the same fashion on your own doctrines here.
This is actually a very, very good point. When Sajid Lipham made a review with a very knowledgeable traditionalist friend of his of my debate, if you want to call it that, with Ali Dawa, they had a lengthy discussion about how Ali Dawa's appeal to philosophy, and the whole argument from contingency is self-defeating and should not be applied within traditionalist Islam, because it could be turned around and used against their own doctrines and understanding of the nature and the appearance of Allah. So this is actually something that you and I or Anthony are not just saying or making up or alleging. This is also something that their fellow traditionalist Muslims point out as well. They also say you should not be making these arguments about the Trinity, because you are in no place to make these arguments, because people could turn around and ask the same questions to you on Allah's body parts and Allah's nature.
Yeah. So in fact, here's a book, if anybody's interested in, this is just one of many resources that you can use on this issue, but this is by Hamza Yusuf. So Hamza Yusuf is not a Salafi. He is a traditional Ash'ari. He believes in Islam, obviously, but he doesn't toe the same line as the Salafis. But in this book, it's on the creed of Imam al-Tahawi, and it focuses on Islamic Aqidah, the doctrine of God. They call it Aqidah. So in this book, he mentions the profound difficulties that are involved in trying to cash out Islamic theology. And at one point, he says, true theology, listen to this. Remember, Ali Dawa is claiming that Christian theology about the Trinity is incoherent. Now, the way he gets there is illicit, because he falsely casts our doctrine as belief in three gods. But this is a self-admission from Hamza Yusuf. He says, true theology is to a certain degree the squaring of a circle within an enlightened mind. So he's calling that mind enlightened that squares the circle.
Yeah, just so everyone knows, squaring the circle is embracing a contradiction.
Right. Yeah. So I mean, that's classic description of what is a contradiction, not merely a paradox. It's one thing to say that you believe two things that you don't know how they're compatible. You don't know how two things go together. You've got good reason to believe in both of these things, but you don't know what what third thing might bring these two things together that shows they're not contradictory. What Hamza Yusuf is admitting is that Islamic theology involves squaring a circle in your mind, which he's calling enlightened. Most of us would call it that kind of a mind an irrational mind, but in any case. But in here, so he's talking about the history of Islamic Aqidah. And he points out that in the early history of Islam, say from the 800s to the 1000s, the most dominant position in Islam regarding Allah and his attributes was that of the Mu'tazili. The Mu'tazili believed that Allah doesn't really have attributes, because if you say that Allah has attributes, then you're conceding that he has parts, and you're therefore denying his unity, right? In other words, the Mu'tazili said you have to say Allah has no attributes, or else you're denying Allah's oneness. You're guilty of shirk. And the Mu'tazili accused other Muslims who affirmed that Allah has attributes, real attributes, parts. He said those Muslims are like Christians. They believe in 3 gods, or more gods, really, right? They believe in as many gods as there are attributes. And by the way, that position is what came to be known as Ash'ari theology. So the Mu'tazili, who were the dominant party from the 8th to 10th centuries, accused them of being polytheists and guilty of shirk. Now, G.F. Haddad, who's a contemporary Muslim, he's got an article where he's defending that the Quran, as Allah's speech, is uncreated. And what's really interesting about this is where people often focus, but they don't realize how radical this really is. It opens a huge, door. But he points out that the Quran, because it's Allah's word, and Allah's word is eternal, but the Quran is not Allah, therefore it is something other than Allah that's uncreated. But notice, since it's uncreated by virtue of it being identified as Allah's speech, his attribute of speech. But if his speech as an attribute is something other than him and counts therefore as another eternal, that would have to be true of all of his attributes on this way of viewing things. And so Haddad, these are his words. Okay? I don't have it in front of me, but I remember these words. He said in his article on the uncreatedness of the Quran, he said, there are as many uncreated things as there are divine attributes. Okay, so however many attributes of Allah you want to talk about, that's how many uncreated things there are. Does that sound like the Tawheed that Muslims love to pretend is the essence of rationality, the heart of the Islamic system, and what we Christians all get wrong? I mean, that just sounds like shirk with a vengeance. They say to the Christians, say not 3, say not 99. And really, 99 is not the limit, right? If you listen to Islamic scholars, when it talks about 99 names of Allah, that's not necessarily the extent of the number of Allah's attributes. That's just a number that's given that itself is but a beginning of the supposedly limitless attributes of Allah. So apparently, at the end of the day, Allah is as many different things as there are attributes.